Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a set of sources here, articles, reports, various pieces, all zeroing in on a really persistent challenge in Kenya right now.
Yeah, we're talking about unemployment, especially, it seems, for younger people.
Exactly. And the sources also dig into what might be causing this and, crucially, how corruption seems to tangle up with, well, opportunity, or the lack of it.
The picture emerging from this material, it's one of significant frustration. You get the sense a lot of people feel locked out no matter how hard they try.
Right. So our goal here is to, unpack what these specific sources are saying, get into the facts, the perspectives presented about unemployment, corruption, and access to jobs in Kenya.
Based purely on the material you've given us.
Absolutely. Just focusing on what's in these documents. So
Okay.
where do we start? I think putting a human face on the numbers makes sense first.
Good idea. There's a story here that really captures the struggle.
Okay. Then we'll get into the bigger picture, the economic side of things, the scale of the problem according to these sources.
And then tackle that really difficult issue the material raises about whether everyone actually gets a fair shot at the jobs that are available.
Sounds like a plan. Let's start with that human story then.
Okay. The sources introduce us to someone named Bill Clinton Muguay. His story is, well, it's pretty powerful. It cuts through the statistics.
Yeah, it really stood out. So the sources say he's an engineering graduate.
And not just any graduate, first-class honors from the University of Nairobi. I mean, that's top tier.
You'd think that would open doors.
You would. But the sources tell us he spent 2 years, 2 full years, looking for a job, or even just an internship,
Wow.
and nothing. He's applied widely, apparently locally, even looking abroad.
It's not like he's just sat back either. The sources mention he's tried other things like coding, blogging, trying to pivot, find something.
Right. But the toll it's taken, it seems immense.
Hmm.
The sources mention him reaching a breaking point.
Yeah, even talking about wanting to burn his degree certificate.
Yeah.
That's intense.
It really shows the level of despair. And he apparently mentioned suffering from depression, starting back in his 3rd and 4th year at uni.
You can really feel that weight, can't you? Just reading the description in the sources.
And there's a family aspect, too, which makes it even tougher, according to the material. He lives with his single mother.
On a small plot of land, like a 1/4 acre, the source said.
And his mother, who sacrificed a lot for his education, is apparently even more frustrated than he is. She'd hoped his degree would be, their way out.
Yeah, change their fortunes. And seeing him struggle like this must be heartbreaking for her.
He basically says, according to the source, that his degree is useless if it doesn't get him a job.
He wants to share, quote, the truth that is in the job market, in the Kenyan job market for graduates. It's pretty raw.
And that's the key point the sources make with his story. He's not alone. He represents really the frustration of millions of young Kenyans.
Carrying that weight of expectation from their families.
Yeah. Exactly. The hope that education is the path forward, and then hitting this wall. His story really anchors the whole issue for us, based on this material.
It certainly does. So let's move from his individual experience to the broader numbers presented in the sources. How big is this problem, really?
Well, the numbers are pretty stark. One source states over 4 million unemployed people in Kenya are graduates. 4 million.
Graduates. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Another source gives the national unemployment rate as 5.7%, which, might not sound catastrophic on its own.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, the same source says youth unemployment is at 67%.
67. That's staggering compared to 5.7 overall.
Exactly. And youth, remember, make up about 35% of the population, according to that source. So a huge chunk of the population facing incredibly high unemployment.
And wasn't there another figure about youth not in education or training either?
Yes. 3.5 million young people are unemployed and not in education or training, often called NEETs. Not in education, employment, or training, pretty much. And this has major knock-on effects, as the sources point out. It contributes to Kenya having one of the highest dependency ratios in the world.
Dependency ratio. What does that mean exactly?
It's the ratio of dependents people too young or too old to work, and the unemployed to the working age population. The source pegs it at 75.4%.
So for every 100 working age people, there are about 75 dependents relying on them.
Essentially, yes. And many of those unemployed are young people. It puts enormous strain on the typically low-income earners who are working.
You can see how that would hold back families and the whole economy. One source explicitly says joblessness inhibits the country's economy.
It's a direct brake on growth. which leads to another point raised in the sources, this kind of paradox.
A paradox, how so?
Well, Kenya has made progress in, like, promoting education, getting more people access to schooling, human capital development, they call it.
Okay, that sounds positive.
It is. But despite that progress, the sources say millions of young Kenyans are still disadvantaged in the job market. The education isn't translating into jobs.
So more people getting educated, but still struggling to find work. Why? Is it the type of education?
That seems to be a big part of it, according to one source. It gives a really specific number. The match between what people study in academic institutions and what the job market actually needs is only 39.1%.
Less than 40%. So more than 60% of what's being taught isn't aligned with job requirements.
That's what the statistic suggests, yeah. A major mismatch. And this feeds directly into the skills gap the sources talk about.
Is skills gap?
Over 1 million young people, one source says, enter the job market every year without any skills. And lack of required skills is cited directly as a barrier to getting hired.
And this problem doesn't just start at university level, does it? The sources mention earlier stages too.
Right. There's a UNESCO report mentioned in one source. It says 30% of kids who finish primary school don't even go on to secondary school.
30%.
Yeah.
Why?
Various reasons cited cultural factors, environmental issues, school-based problems, or just socioeconomic hardship. But the result is a huge group isn't even getting basic secondary education, let alone job-specific skills.
It shows the challenge is layered, starting way back.
Definitely. But the sources do mention some efforts trying to fix this, particularly the skills mismatch.
Okay, like what?
Well, NGOs like KPA, that's the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, are working with the government's TVET sector.
TVET, technical and vocational education and training, so practical skills.
Exactly. Skills for specific jobs. And one program highlighted involves KPA and others, supported by something called the EU Cup Youth Empowerment Institute.
EU funded, presumably?
Looks like it. They're training school dropouts and unemployed graduates. The whole idea is summed up as learning to earn.
Learning to earn. I like that. Does it work? What do the sources say about impact?
The sources report it's helped over 30,000 young people since 2011. And the results sound, well, quite good. 77% job creation reported.
77%. That's impressive.
And about 8% starting their own micro or small businesses.
Ah, so not just jobs, but entrepreneurship too.
Yeah, and interestingly, the sources mentioned the program helps aspiring entrepreneurs by providing necessary tools, getting over that initial hurdle of needing equipment or capital.
So there are some targeted efforts making a difference, tackling that skills gap head-on, even helping youth become job creators themselves. That's something positive from the sources.
It is. It shows there's recognition of the problem and attempts to address it, even if the overall scale of unemployment remains daunting.
Daunting enough that the sources say it's been called a ticking time bomb.
Yes, by both President Ruto and his predecessor, according to the material. It signals this isn't a new problem, it's a long-standing critical issue.
And the current government, the sources mention, is trying things like the affordable housing program, hoping to create construction jobs and pushing a labor export agenda.
Sending Kenyans to work abroad, basically.
Right. But while these government initiatives exist, the sources also touch on that classic economic principle.
That ultimately, job creation needs to be driven by the private sector.
Yeah. And the government's role is mainly to create the right environment for businesses to thrive and hire.
Makes sense. But how healthy is that environment, according to these sources? There seems to be a bit of a mixed message.
There does. On one hand, you have the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, KNBS. Their data, cited in the sources, showed employment growth in 2023.
Both formal and informal sectors grew.
Yeah, 4.1% informal, 4.5% in informal for 2023. Sounds okay.
It does. But then you have the Federation of Kenya Employers,
Yeah.
the FKE.
Representing the bosses.
Right. And they paint, quote, a bleak picture for 2024, according to the sources.
Bleak how?
They report that just 57 of their member companies told them they made 5,567 Kenyans redundant between 2022 and 2024. Layoffs.
Over 5,500 layoffs from just 57 companies.
Yeah. And the FKE apparently believes the real total number of job losses across the economy is actually much higher than what they were formally notified about.
So, official stats show growth in 23, but employers are reporting significant redundancies continuing into 24 and sounding the alarm.
Exactly. And the sources list some specific companies linked to job cuts or closure fears. CMC Motors shutting operations in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania.
Right, I saw that mention. Others too.
Base titanium, iridium, G4S are also named the sources in this context.
So why are employers struggling, according to the FKE in these documents? What are the reasons they give?
They list a whole bunch of things: low demand for their products or services, cash flow problems, liquidity constraints, rising costs.
Okay.
A challenging tax regime is mentioned frequently. Lots of legislative changes making planning hard. A shrinking market, losing competitiveness. It's a long list of pressures.
Basically, they're saying it's really tough to do business and hire right now. That's their perspective in the sources.
That's the picture the FKE paints. But it's important to note the sources also say not everyone agrees with their numbers.
Who disagrees?
The Central Organization of Trade Unions, COTU, representing workers.
Ah, the unions. What do they say?
They dispute the FKE's redundancy figures. The source says COTU called them propaganda.
Propaganda. So a direct clash between employers and unions on the extent of job losses.
Yeah, that disagreement itself is significant, as reported here, shows very different views on the economic reality.
Does the FKE suggest solutions? What do they want the government to do, according to the sources?
They do offer recommendations. They want an end to what they call the raid on pay slips.
Meaning less tax and deductions.
Pretty much. They argue against new taxes that burden businesses and increase payroll deductions. They specifically mention concern about deductions being based on total earnings now, not just basic pay like before.
Okay, so tax policy is a big one for them. Anything else?
They also recommend honoring collective bargaining agreements, paying pending government bills to businesses on time that helps with cash flow,
Right.
and generally strengthening accountability and transparency in government budgets to cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse.
So their call is for less financial burden, more stability, and better governance, basically.
That's the gist of their recommendations as presented in the sources. It paints a really complex picture of the business side of things.
It really does. Growth reported by stats, but employers' warning of hardship and job cuts, and unions disputing those warnings, it's messy.
Which unfortunately brings us to maybe the most disheartening part of the material you shared. The part that goes beyond economics or skills.
You mean the corruption, the lack of a level playing field.
Exactly. The sources are really blunt about this. Job bribes, nepotism, called a major challenge, and even a huge betrayal of young Kenyans.
A huge betrayal. That's strong language.
It reflects the feeling, I think. Constitutionally, everyone's supposed to have an equal right to opportunities, like public sector jobs.
But the sources show the reality is very different.
Very different. The examples are quite specific. Remember the outcry over Teacher Service Commission letters? TSC letters.
Yeah, the appointment letters for teachers. What was the issue again?
Some members of Parliament were reportedly just given bundles of these letters to hand out. Dishing out, the source calls it.
Like political favors.
That's the implication. One source mentions 11 MPs in central Kenya getting 20 letters each. Another quotes a politician admitting he got 100 letters to distribute.
100 teaching jobs given out by one politician. How is that supposed to work?
The sources link it directly to political affiliation. Jobs based on who you know or support, not necessarily who is qualified or applied through proper channels. The TSC is the official hiring body, remember?
And it wasn't just about connections, was it? The sources mentioned money changing hands, too.
Explicitly. Huge bribes, one source says, up to 100,000 shillings demanded for jobs, including teaching jobs.
So even if you're qualified, you might need connections or cash. Or both.
That's the implication. It prices out people who are qualified but don't have the money or the godfather, as one source puts it.
And it's not just teaching, right? The sources mention other areas.
Yeah. Officials from the ruling party, UDA, were also reportedly handing out appointment letters for the Kenya Forestry Service. Another example of political influence cited.
And what about police and military recruitment? That's often a sensitive area.
The sources describe those recruitments as avenues for graft. Slots allegedly going to the highest bidder, or, again, those with connections.
It sounds completely systemic based on these accounts.
It seems that way. And maybe the clearest example of the systemic unfairness highlighted in the sources is that high court ruling from last year, March 2023.
Tell us about that again. It involved the tax authority.
That's right, the Kenya Revenue Authority, KRA. They had hired 1,400 new tax assistants.
Okay.
But the High Court canceled those hires, revoked them completely.
Why? What was the reason?
Lack of regional balance. The court found that 56%, more than half of those 1,400 jobs, went to people from just two ethnic communities.
Two communities got 56% of the jobs, in a country with over 40 ethnic groups.
Exactly. The court ruled it violated the constitutional requirement for fair representation and regional balance in public service hiring.
That KRA case is a really stark illustration from the sources. It shows it's not just about individual bad actors demanding bribes, but potential bias built into the hiring processes of state institutions.
It directly undermines that guarantee of fair and equal treatment for everyone.
So putting it all together from these sources, corruption, nepotism, regional imbalance, it means for many young Kenyans, finding work isn't just about skills or qualifications.
It can often come down to who you know or how much money you can pay. That's the harsh reality described in this material.
Which loops us right back to Bill Clinton Muguay, doesn't it? And the millions like him. Their struggle, as depicted here, it's not just about a shortage of jobs, it's about a system that feels fundamentally unfair.
Precisely. The sources paint a picture not just of an economic challenge, but a real crisis of equity and trust in the very system meant to provide opportunity.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive into this particular set of sources, we've seen the sheer scale of youth unemployment in Kenya described.
Yeah, the personal cost highlighted through stories like Bill Clinton's.
The paradox of having education but still facing joblessness, driven partly by that skills mismatch.
The pressures reported by employers in the private sector, alongside conflicting views on the job market's health.
And finally, that deeply ingrained problem of corruption and lack of equal opportunity poisoning the well, based on these accounts.
All these factors, as laid out in the sources, are interconnected. They create this really tough environment for young Kenyans trying to get ahead.
So considering everything these sources have put on the table, academic success not guaranteeing work, a business environment described by some as difficult and shedding jobs, and this pervasive issue where connections or money seem to dictate hiring, it leaves us with a pretty challenging thought, doesn't it? And maybe one for you, our listener, to think about too, based on this material.
What does this combination of factors, as presented in these specific sources, suggest about the real future prospects for Kenya's young generation? And what could the long-term impact be on the country's overall development?
A lot to mull over there.